where are we with this freedom project of ours that started on the 27th of April 1994? So listen out for that. But I'm also interested in getting the big picture into the value of a vote. We certainly thought we knew what the value of the vote was on the 27th of April 1994, but now lots of people questioning that value of the vote. So let's talk about that. My guest today is Mmusi Maimane. Mmusi, appreciate your time. Good morning and welcome to the show.
Good morning, Assalamu alaikum, and I wish you well for the home stretch of the fast, and thank you
Well,
for having me.
as I've actually said on that home stretch, thanks. Yeah, we haven't connected in a while, Musi. So
Yeah.
let's talk about this. I mean, so once you were of the ANC as a supporter, then you were part of the DA, then you were the DA leader, and now very much a part of the one SA or one South Africa movement. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But let me get to the nub of what I want to talk to you about here, which it according to you, then, having been through all of what I've said above, what for you is the value of a vote?
Look, I mean, I think, first of all, the principle of democratic change using the vote is still fundamental because in other parts of the world, people change governments by other means. They change them violently, they change them coups, and especially in Africa, we've seen military coups. So I think for South Africa to have a culture of voting is a securitization of our rights as citizens. But for me personally, it's always an opportunity for us to, I can remember my first vote. I didn't get to vote in 1994, I was too young. But I can remember the next election subsequent, being able to express as a young South African, my first vote as 18, I was able to give a mandate to a government. And so there's a value in being able to be in charge of the affairs of your country. But I think over the number of years, as I have seen votes in parliament, votes not only on the ballot in the national election, I've seen that ultimately that principle still remains. You are able to send a message as an individual to the government that you are happy or unhappy. You are able to use your vote or withdraw it. So to me, it's paramount that given the history of our country, given the fact that so my parents were marginalized from voting, that I take that as a sacred component of democracy. In fact, I would argue that of all the things that democracy provides, whether it's human rights, etc., the vote still remains central because if you don't
Mm.
get the vote right, then all of the democratic project falls apart.
But you see, here's the point about the concept of the vote. For many people, I'm going back to 1994 when we voted for the first time. For many people, the point was the vote is the key, and I'm going to use an ANC phrase: the vote is the key to a better life for all. But you can look at South Africa. You can also look at scenarios in many parts of the world. It may be a vehicle to a better life for all, but it doesn't. There's so many examples where it just doesn't do that.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that perhaps maybe at some level, a vote is merely but giving a mandate. What we fail to do is do the second part. Almost when you show up at the ballot box, you've done 50%. The second 50% is about making sure that post that, you curb excesses of power and you monitor those. I think South Africans are democratically active in many ways. They vote, even though the numbers are declining, but they protest for services, they demand better. But I think what we've got to do now is enhance the next value out of that. We can't have a democracy that is a 5-year anniversary, that every 5 years we go vote and then forget about it. I think what we've got to do is strengthen all the other aspects of governance to say to ourselves, do people interact with parliament? Do people interact with their members of parliament, etc.? So that that accountability is there. And it's precisely why we've been fighting almost extremely on the issue of direct elections, because we vote for parties and then parties leave us behind. After 5 years they disappear. Now what we're saying to them is, actually, let's vote directly for a person, so that if a hospital is broken, you know exactly who you're talking to. If a school doesn't work, you know exactly, so that you don't only say, Musi, I will vote for you to go represent me, but I will also use the privilege of having lent you my
Mm,
vote
mm.
so that I can keep interacting with you, so that you are accountable to me.
Are you saying therefore that the value of the vote is still invaluable? It has massive value, but the value of a vote via a political party has diminished in value.
Yeah, I'm certainly saying that. I think that the diminishing aspect of the vote especially in a proportional representatives system, is that it means, in essence, that even if only 100 people turn out to vote and one party gets 50 or 51 of those votes, they get the power to lead the government, and almost, if you like, they can lose an ability to want to ever listen to those people, regardless of what happens. So to me, I think if we can strengthen the capability of that, and it's not just me saying that, I think
Mm-hmm.
even President Mandela in 1994 recognized that the way we voted needed a sunset, in that we needed to reform the way our elections were held almost post the second set of elections. President Kgalema Motlanthe stood on the same thing. And in fact, we had the Van Zyl Slabbert report that said we've got to strengthen with the meaning of that vote so that it gives it more power and that public representatives
Mm-hmm.
know who to fear. So I really think that that work has to be done if we're going to mature democracy. Tomorrow is 28 years. And in that 28 years, if I was to say, here's the one thing we need to focus on, we would need to reform how do we strengthen democracy. Because like any other thing, after 28 years or 30 years, it would be fair enough to look at it and go, is it still working? Is it not? And I think it's only working 50%. It's not working for the second half of what citizens desperately need.
Yeah, I think the broader question is: Will the incumbents allow that sort of electoral reform to happen? Don't quite answer that right now. And go back to your point about direct representation. I mean, play it out. I'm looking at the American example of where ultimately people vote for the president, but to be the president, there's a party vote that takes place in the first place. So yes, at presidential level, it's the president. Now, I want to understand more what you say when you say a direct vote of an elected official. Play that out for me. What does it mean in practice?
In practice, if we were courageous enough as South Africa, we would take the country and put it into at least 52 constituencies. In those constituencies, you could have, for example, the bigger ones with bigger population numbers can have a number of members of parliament that get ranked out of that constituency. And so, what that effectively would mean is that when you would arrive at a ballot box, rather than saying, I am voting for Mmusi of this party, you could literally say, even if the person is under a party, you would know their name, you would know what they stand for, and they would have to come and earn your vote. So that's the first thing, is that you would be voting directly for people. You would know them, even if they were independent or from a party. You could literally say, this is the person. And then because of we've written the bill in such a way it didn't require a constitutional amendment, all of those people in parliament would represent a particular constituency, which would effectively mean that when you elect the president in this country, you would then be able to free. Our constitution is already written that way, anyways. The president ceases to be a member of parliament and becomes the leader of the executive, and ultimately, parliament holds them to account. So, to me, unlike the American system, so yeah, fair enough, the American system goes directly into the point of saying, let's vote for the president. And with all of its flaws, the big advantage in the American system is that if you say, for argument's sake, you did not like President Trump or you didn't like President Obama, when you had enough of them, you would go to the polls and bring about a change. In South Africa, even if you like or don't like the president, and you've cited where I come from, I voted for President Mbeki, but when President Mbeki was removed, no one bothered to ask me. It was like a waste of my vote in many ways. So we've got to get back to a system where you can't simply remove a president because you so chose to do so, and that the president always knows that the first fear they have is not to the party, but it's to the citizens. So even if the party says X and the citizens say Y must be done because that's who vote. And in this year, this is such an important issue because we go to an ANC elective conference at the end of the year, and every citizen is sitting on the edge of their seats as if that's the election to elect our country's president. It's actually not. It's an election to elect the ANC's president, to
But
elect the
the
country's.
reality, and I think you raise an interesting point. But the reality is the way the country is shaped up now. It almost does become that election of the ANC president de facto becomes the election of the country's president. I know that could well change. We don't know, but the point I think I understand what you're making is it is bloated in terms of the importance of the party president, and you want to change that, right?
Yeah, and even worse than to the point that you make is that effectively what you are also saying is that de facto only 4,000 people or delegates at an ANC conference elect the state president, and you can't have that. So what we've got to do is make sure that an ANC elective conference or a DA elective conference or a PAC elective conference or whatever party's elective conference, all of them become as sideshow as it is and only relevant to their parties. And then when we go to vote, we can decide. I dream of a day where one day we could actually directly elect the president. That would require constitutional amendment. But if we were able to do that, you would have then a president who's empowered by the citizens rather than simply by party. And ultimately, they would then be able to have the full mandate of saying, if
Mm, mm.
55% of the people or 51% of the people think I should lead, this is how I'm going to lead because they back the vision. At the moment in time, in truth, if we are honest with ourselves, the president has no space where he or she is obligated to listen to the
Yeah,
citizens.
I mean, I look at the example of, and you mentioned the USA, but also look at the example that's very topical right now of Pakistan, where the current, the incumbent prime minister a couple of weeks back, the former World Cup winning captain Imran Khan was deposed, but by political parties that rightly or wrongfully chose that they don't rate him anymore. But again, there it was not to the it was not the masses. They didn't have a referendum on him. It was actually up to the political parties
Yeah.
that could make that call. And you saying, I mean, if I reflect on that, how did the world then come to accept that form of democracy?
You mean as we have it, or as
Yeah,
as
as we have it. So I'm giving the Pakistan example is very similar. That
yeah.
even if he was justified to remove him, the decision was taken by political parties, but not the voters and the supporters of those parties, not the masses of the nation of Pakistan.
Yeah, I think it has emerged for us as a country. One of the things that we needed to protect in 1994 was the principle of proportional representation, and we made it sine qua non with our demographics in our country. Part of what we needed to achieve was to say, well, what you didn't want is because it became so common cause that the ANC would win overwhelmingly, that minorities in our country would not have representation. And that was a courageous generation that knew that even though they could get it all, they didn't take it all. They allowed for minority parties to have a voice, and secondly, they removed the threshold, which meant that a party of 1.7% could still have representation in parliament. That served us well then. Now we've gone past that, in that society is no longer a contestation of black versus white, it or any faith versus another faith. It ought to be truly about ideas and a vision for the future. Now we are at that point, and I would argue that it's a time for us to reform it. So it served us well in the beginning. I can't deny that. If you
Mhm.
didn't have that in the beginning, you would literally today have certain citizens marginalized to the periphery because they didn't have the numbers for representation. But I do think now going forward, it is very possible that a South African who is black is capable of representing a South African who is white and Afrikaans, just as much as a South African who is Muslim has the capability of representing someone who is a Christian or not. It just means that you are the best person for the job and we can directly elect you.
Interesting you gave that example, and this is not a political example, but this is a practical example of changing society. I mean, you mentioned the different faiths and race groups. When it comes to, for example, the gift of the givers, and I chatted to MJ Suleiman yesterday, people don't talk about his faith, people don't talk about what inspired him because he's able to solve problems in the country. And that's the type of vision that we want to, that's the country we want to live in, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I celebrate the work that Imtiaz is doing, and I want to just on this platform thank him on behalf of the people of South Africa, and certainly of wherever he's been able to respond in deep times of crisis. I want to celebrate him as a proud South African and thank him. And I just would argue strongly that that's exactly the kind of South Africa we want to build. It's a South Africa whereupon we could say, actually, your vision for our nation is an inclusive one that is not linear in the sense that it says, I will only serve people who look like me, worship the same God as me, or whatever. Because when we get into that space, I think we end up in scenarios where we get partisanship and we end up in a fragmented society. And I fear that there are a number of leaders who are rising up. And at some level, they start to make it about immigrants or make it about foreigners. But it's dangerous as a trend because it's only a matter of time when you are done with immigrants to say to yourself, oh, well, it must be the Zulus or it must be the Xhosas or it must be the Muslims, so it must be the Christians, and so off we go. And I think that's not the vision of a society we want to leave. So contrast the vision that MTS has with the vision of some of our political leaders. I would argue the case that the reason I, in fact, went out and started One South Africa is because I
Mhm.
fundamentally work on that value that says it is possible that South Africans, regardless of where they come from, can work together for the prosperity of all South Africans.
So let's then talk more about the One South Africa movement. So practically, what is it? What does the movement want to do? What's your daily gig around it? What do you do?
Yeah. Yeah. For us, we want to build a grassroots movement that empowers communities to effectively be able to take power back to themselves. And we strengthen that. We focus on issues of education. We focus on economic issues. So we help young people who can't find work, etc. We also focus on issues of elections, so to give direct election and give expression. So at the last local government elections, we worked with a number of independent candidates across the country, and I was grateful. And it proved there was proof to the pudding in that if the independents across the country were a party, they would be fourth or fifth in the electoral space. So, which means if you want to build that alternative, it must come from being community led. And the last powerful thing is that I honestly believe what sits in every human being is a value for another human being. So the value of Ubuntu, we mobilize around that because I think I must see that you're a human being before I see that you're anything other. And then furthermore, that when you activate a sense of purposefulness amongst people, you find citizens respond. You find that they say to themselves, actually, we could do something for our government. The other mistake that took place in 94 is that we sort of said, okay, now we've got the ANC in power, or we've got freedom, and I put it in inverted commas,
Mhm.
we can all now go on with our business and let the state do what the state wants to do. And the state has done what the state wants to do, and it's brought us to this point. So what we've got to do now is get back to saying what sits within us, the sense of activism, the sense of communities, because we know it in education, for example, when parents are involved with their kids' education, the education system changes, that school succeeds, and more kids pass. We know that when people start their micro enterprise in communities, they're able to employ more people and are able to create jobs locally. So I think inbuilt within citizens themselves is an ability to be activists in their communities. And I think that's the
Mm.
next phase, if you like, the second transition of our democratic
That needs to happen now.
project.
Okay, I think you raised something important because I certainly, as you speak about education, I think about it. You're right. No matter who's in charge of the Department of Education, and you pronounced on that recently, I know that. Um, Ultimately, schools work well when parents in some form support it. I look at someone who joins a football or cricket club or rugby club. If you don't get the parents at grassroots level still supporting the coach, that club doesn't function. So it's an interesting one. But what you're saying is that in fact, we delegated authority in 1994 to the parties we vote for, and it's been the same all the time. How then? I mean, so practically with something regarding politics, how do we vote for a candidate now at constitution, constituent or ward level, as you've suggested, and give them some semblance of power, but still ensure that the checks and balances are there, but they are so regular that that leader also can't be hamstrung, because that's the flip side of that. If that person is to be accountable every day to a meeting, they're not going to be able to function and carry out the work that we're asking them to do.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I always use the Uber example, right? When you get into an Uber, you don't assess the driver on the basis of their ability to make coffee. You have five criterion. You say to them, do they drive safely? Are they wearing a mask? Whatever the case might be. And then when you walk out of that Uber, you rate them. And I'm arguing the case that if we create a criterion that says, did my member of parliament respond to my issues on education, on healthcare, on the competences that are given in the constitution for what an MP must do, you can rate them. And technology allows us the space to do that. And then we could quarterly or 6 monthly be able to assess that. And we'll be able to glean quite quickly that actually this MP isn't doing their job, or this MP is doing their job. Because quite frankly, we pay money as citizens for MPs to do constituency work. So at this point in time, we have no mechanism of assessing whether that constituency work is being done or not done. But furthermore than that, you'd be able to know annually to say, there's performance in this community or there isn't performance in that community, and you can keep assessing that permanently. So the oversight is there. But furthermore, when you then come into parliamentary programs, etc., when that MP has to go deliver, because Parliament actually does a lot of work in the year, but the most important work happens around State of the Nation, around budget votes, and around budget accountability. It means that Member of Parliament is able to go, hang on, when I go vote for the budget, have I heard from my community? I can't just say our community doesn't need a bridge when actually, as we saw in the Eastern Cape, people are
Mm,
using a
mm,
drum
mm,
for
mm.
someone to roll around in water. You could
Yeah.
simply say, I want to go vote for our community for a bridge. Now that mandate is there, because at the end of the 5 year period, you could say, Musi, we voted for you to just get us a bridge. That's all we asked you to do. And you didn't. We're going to vote for someone else.
I
Or
mean,
you
I think
did.
yeah, it's an interesting analogy because I mean, you obviously aware that I drive a project called Champion South Africa, and whereas we're not a political space, the vision is to build a champion nation, which actually means getting people like yourself and the MTR Suleimans and all the political parties to get on side, right? But in doing that, I think the key part here, as I talk to you, is you fix a country by fixing communities, and at the moment, it's almost the other way around. We
Yeah.
we we elect leaders and we hope they filter down through at community level, and by and large that doesn't quite happen. How then do we make community priority, and what happens at national level secondary?
Yeah, no. And I think one of the neglected spaces in our country is local government. I mean, I can only think of two or three municipalities that I would look at and say these are working relatively well as far as citizens are rating them. But in truth, if you go to Mangaung, Mangaung hasn't had water for 9 days. That's a metro in the country. When you look at where the state of metros, municipalities, district municipalities, you realize they're in a dire state. So I think we've got to flip the pyramid a little bit and put local governments. One of the things that I and certainly been writing about is to say let's focus back on municipalities because that's where the rubber hits the road. Let's give citizens more power to interact with their municipalities. That's why I think even if our system is imperfect, the reason you have ward councillors is because it was viewed, and you can directly vote for a ward councillor, is because you wanted for government to come back down to the people. So we've got to strengthen that, hold it to much more accountability. And if you reform the Electoral Act, it would force even the members of parliament to say, even if I do anything, I still have to get back to my community and my constituency because those are the people that are actually doing the work. And it de-intensifies all the national kind of politics and it focuses back to the people. But lastly, I think we've got to engender a sense upon which, to our earlier question, citizens must know their power. People often say, no, the government dumbs down the people through education. I think the government dumbs down people by making them concentrate on things that are not impactful to them. It's what Noam Chomsky says, that you narrow the debate and make sure that within that space, the debate is lively. So today, you and I can debate whether or not we should decolonize education, and it'll be a lively debate, and it's an important
Mm,
debate.
mm, mm.
But we haven't bothered to figure out whether the schools have got a roof or pit latrines are being fixed or teachers are showing up on time, all of those things. We don't talk about that because that almost is to the periphery. It's like safety. When you think about the fact that since 94, just over 500,000 people have been murdered in this country. We don't talk about that because we're better off blaming the immigrant, etc., etc. So to me, I think we've got to get back to saying, let's stop dumbing down communities. Let's force MPs to actually go account for the things that matter to people. Let me, in my whole thing, here's the most painful things that I see. If you and I today had to interact with any government service of any kind. So let's go get an ID. Let's just you and I go get an
Yeah.
ID document,
Mm,
which is by right something the government must provide. It would take both you and I a day out of our daily work,
mm,
and
mm,
and
mm.
and we'd have to wait subsequent to that. Now that to me is bizarre. In a world where I can apply for a bank card via WhatsApp and it'll be delivered to my house the following day, it's just bizarre. So to
Yeah,
me, I think
absolutely.
where citizens experience government services, where the things actually matter, I think we've failed our citizens profoundly.
So picking up that point that you said, citizens must know their power. What then is the power of a citizen?
Not only to elect the state, but ultimately to hold that state to account. What we haven't seen is and all the framework of our constitution is written in such a way that it gives profound powers to the to citizens. So when it comes to parliament and parliamentary votes, actually through the National Council of Provinces, citizens have to give voice as to what the national budget ought to function like. And often they get run roughshod. There can be no law in this country that is passed unless it has public participation. So citizens must go on and speak about those things. We haven't made those things public because it's easier for politicians to just get away with doing the bare minimum and ultimately forgetting what citizens in fact think. So I do think we must exercise those constitutional powers, but we must even broaden them and much more inclusive by making
Okay.
sure that they have powers to recall if they don't like something. So if I don't like my ward councillor, rather than burning their house, can I put a petition together and get those people removed? That's part of the work we've got to do.
And that is the power of the citizen. I mean, we can talk about 50 things that's not working in South Africa. That'll take us another 2 hours, maybe a further conversation in our Twitter spaces one of the days. But for now, right, I'll wrap up with this, Mmusi. So tomorrow, of course, 28 years when we all voted for the very first time, right? Just very quickly then, what can you draw on those 28 years in terms of providing a pointer for us to say, Ashraf, this is working in 28 years, but this requires absolutely serious attention and serious interventions, or else?
I think we have a strong constitution. Even though we may disagree with it, I think that, yes, sure, there might be some adjustments, but the constitution still holds. Term limits still hold. Can you imagine if we didn't have term limits? It means that we would have a president who could stay for life. So we've seen a recycling of presidents, and we've seen that votes actually take place. So those things, in fact, do work. And I think I celebrate that. That's part of the celebration. But I think if we don't fix our economy, we're going to have problems. So let me leave you just with this one scary thought. If South Africa had grown at the same level as what developing economies are, so Turkey, Chile, not any big ones, just the developing, our counterparts,
Mm-hmm.
we would have 23 million people employed as opposed to 14. So when we look at ourselves, I think tomorrow we need to reflect on the fact that economically we've lagged behind. We can't keep the lights on, we can't ensure that businesses are sustainable, and we can't create jobs. And if you can't do that, at the end of the day, when it's said and done, and you miseducate your citizens in the way that the government is doing, you are going to end up in a scenario where, regardless of those rights being in the constitution, hungry people cannot claim freedom. And
Yeah,
so, to me, that must be the primary focus.
and that's where we shall leave it, because I'll pick up on the point that you made. Something for us to think about when you said, we can't keep the lights on. So, Ascom is a classic example of that. But to go back to your point, for the citizens, when we can't keep the lights on, maybe the message to them or to you as a citizen is like, we, or you and I, we have the power. Mmusi Maimane, thanks for your time. Very enlightening, and thank you for giving us the big picture into what we call the value or the power of the vote.
Much appreciated.
There we are, Mmusi Maimane from the One South Africa movement. Lots to reflect on that conversation, and we'll probably do a lot more of that tomorrow, being Freedom Day, with 4 young South Africans. So much more still to come here on the Ashraf Garda Show on Salam.